if you try to understand just how big this is for any particular large device manufacturer, some of these folks might have 200,000 ship-to locations or more, right? So keeping the proper contact information for all these places is it's an impossibility.
Without supplies, there's no surgery. Without products, there's no patient care. Welcome to Power Supply, the healthcare supply chain podcast focused on helping you navigate the intricacies of logistics, purchasing, contracting, and supplier relationships. Each episode, we speak with healthcare executives, supply chain leaders, and innovative entrepreneurs from across the country as they share their stories, experience, and expertise on the industry we love. From the loading dock to strategic sourcing, from buyers to the C-suite and across the enterprise, we tackle the real-life issues impacting the healthcare supply chain. Whether you're tuning in for conversation or inspiration, we're glad you're here. You're just in time to hear it from the source and stock up on insight. So sit back and plug into Power Supply.
This week on Power Supply, we speak with Guillermo Ramos, Chief Executive Officer at Notisphere. And Hayes, we're going to be talking about product recalls. I saw some postings from Guillermo on LinkedIn, and I think he even connected with a business partner of mine, Hank Balch, who does all of our marketing here at Power Supply, as well as some of our sister podcasts, First Case and Beyond Clean. And it just seemed like he had a real strong passion for the industry, helping supply chain, and hopped on a call with them and just learned about how inefficient this process is. And we're going to get into it today. And Hayes, I love, as everybody's about to learn, he's got a very sort of interesting passion for constantly tweaking and improving things and being productive himself. It's no wonder to me, after having this conversation, how he would see an opportunity to make this process more productive and efficient.
Absolutely. I mean, he's an amazing guy. He comes over here from another country, puts down roots, and he starts to work in healthcare, gets deep into it. He's an analytics guy, super smart. You're going to be amazed by what you learn today. And I'm thrilled for everybody to hear him.
All right, well, let's just get right into it. We're going to be right back with Guillermo Ramos, Chief Executive Officer at Notisphere, after a short break.
I'm Hayes Walder.
And I'm Justin Poulin.
A production of 17 Studios. You're listening to Power Supply.
Joining us now is Guillermo Ramos, Chief Executive Officer at Notisphere. And today we're going to be talking about product recalls and how we can do it better. And so I'm really excited. Guillermo, you and I had a chance to connect on LinkedIn, which is a great way to get yourself an appearance on an episode of Power Supply. But also we had a chance to talk, and I just love your passion for this industry and your knowledge about the entire sort of continuum, where we've been and where we're going. So we're really going to dive into that today. But I thought first, just welcome you to the show. Thanks for coming on.
Thanks, Justin. It's great to be here. Appreciate
and
it.
then why don't you tell everybody a little bit about your background, your experience in the industry?
Sure. I came to the U.S. in 1996, and I've dedicated pretty much every year since then to work in healthcare technology. I spent quite a few years implementing ERP systems at hospitals. And then I joined one of the largest GPOs in healthcare to deal with analytics and other commercial products that I designed and developed. But mostly, I've spent a couple of decades now just focused on trying to solve problems. At the end of the day, I think we got plenty of problems that need solving, right? So you don't need to look too far, and I think it's a good mission.
Absolutely. Guillermo, I've got a question for you. This is kind of out of left field, right? And I have a tendency to do that. And so obviously during the pandemic, that impacted everybody. Obviously the last 12, 14, 15 months. I'm just going to ask you right out, what did you do during the pandemic that wasn't work related? Anything, any passions, hobbies that popped up?
Plenty, actually, Hayes. So you're right in that when the pandemic started, the one thing I did tell my team was, okay, let's back off from trying to contact folks in supply chain and healthcare, right? Because they've got their hands full. They're scrambling, trying to find protective supplies, et cetera. So we don't need to be a headache. We only need to help, not make things worse. So I actually, outside of work, I love motorcycles. Folks that know me have known this now for quite some time. And I have 3 daughters. The oldest is actually into motorcycles as well. So I found ourselves a couple of different projects, old Enduros from the 70s that needed restoring. So you can buy them really cheap, and they become almost like puzzles you're going to work on for a few months while the pandemic was going on. Great opportunity to spend some quality time with my daughter while also bringing these things back to life. All right.
That is phenomenal. That is really cool. So are they actually the ones that you worked on? Are they on the road yet?
They are. 2 of them are. And in fact, I just took one out for a couple of runs around the block just to make sure everything, no bolts were going to fall apart. And everything worked just fine. So I'm really happy.
Hopefully you're the one that did the test drive and not your daughter.
Yes, yeah, absolutely. Although she is itching to get on it, but I told her we're going to go trailing. I don't like her on the street. We'll do off-road.
I'm amazed that you found a good constructive way to spend time together. And both of my daughters are preteen. They're 13 and 14 now. And when we hit that pandemic, it was quality time for the first 4 weeks. And then it was, there's not enough room in this house the rest of the time. So well done in the way that you navigated that. All right, so let's dive into the topic for today. We're going to talk about product recalls. And why don't you just tell the audience, and I think everybody's pretty familiar, but not just what are they, but what really causes these product recalls to happen? What's the underlying root cause?
So what's interesting is product recalls, the way that the FDA understands them or names them, are probably a little broader than what people are used to thinking about. A product recall is really an information or an alert on a product. So recall doesn't necessarily mean that an item needs to be pulled off a shelf or stop being used. It could, in some cases, just be what they call product service alerts, field service notices, etc. So that could be any kind of information related to the product that's subject to the recall. Could be use the product differently, or the packaging of the product is about to change, please note, right? So in some cases, to avoid confusion, those kind of things. But more importantly, I think the vast majority of folks do think about a recall as, hey, I need to stop using this item. Those are obviously the more serious recalls, things that could endanger patients and cause problems.
Did you have a lot of involvement in this or exposure to it when you were working with the GPO? Like, how did you obviously you didn't just fall into this and go, hey, let's just tackle that one. You must have got your hands a little dirty, before you started to create the company.
What's fascinating to me is that for many years, I did work obviously very closely with healthcare provider organizations, being hospital systems, health systems, and got to see firsthand the challenges that they faced with receiving recall alerts, executing on recalls, et cetera. What was not obvious to me was the fact that on the other side of that table, at the other side of that industry is the supplier, right? The organization issuing a recall. And I was absolutely clueless to the amount of challenges that those folks face with the process as well. And I can tell you that most providers are not aware of the challenges faced by the suppliers with us. They might have some idea, but the level of pain that the current process in place in the industry today causes to both sides of that industry is just phenomenal.
So what is that process like? I mean, has it changed much? Where are we at kind of in the improvement?
Yeah. Well, no, I don't think it's changed much. So if you really think about it today, suppliers are basically, medical device manufacturers are using the same process that was in place more than 40 years ago. Okay. And it basically consists of determining what locations received items that are affected by a recall. As you know, sometimes a recall only affects a batch or a lot, right? It doesn't need to be every single item in a particular model. It could just be a small group of those items. And then FedExing or sending certified mail to those locations. Now,
wait, snail mail?
Yep. They do now. Most of them do FedEx or UPS. They want to do overnights, right? Especially when it's a serious recall, which happens often. But the fact of the matter is that's actually what the FDA regulation book says. It was written and approved back in 1976, and it talks about, believe it or not, Justin, it talks about telegrams. Which I think is crazy. Yes.
In its current iteration, it still talks about telegrams.
Well, so what happens is the book itself, the regulations need Congress approval to change, right? So that doesn't happen often.
About every 50 years. No.
Give or take a decade or so.
Give or take a few, right?
We're due. We got 10 years to our window.
But in all fairness, what the FDA does do is they publish guidelines that are meant to interpret those regulations with their current views. So today you do have guidelines from the FDA explaining that they encourage the use of electronic means of communication to communicate these product-related alerts, as long as there's a way of tracking who receives it and allowing the hospitals then to provide acknowledgement back to the suppliers and say, hey, I got this notice and I've acted on it. And that's the important piece, right?
Well, I was going to ask, obviously back in the day when I was on the manufacturing side in the implant business, we had recalls from time to time, but help me now. Obviously, that's been a while. Give me an idea about the scope. How many recalls are we talking about? How hard is it for a hospital system? Are they getting 2 or 3 a week? Or are we talking about dozens and dozens? Kind of give me a feel for that.
Okay, that's a fantastic question. Hey, so here's the reality. And in order to explain what a hospital suffers today, I'll give you maybe one step behind in the process. So you have the FDA that comes out with a regulation back in 1976. The process gets put in place by most suppliers and device manufacturers. So they have this process that sends the paper. The paper gets sent to all of the locations that receive the affected item. Now, that's a first key point is there are multiple locations in any given health system that receive items. It's not just the receiving doc. Sometimes there's drop ship into a particular department, a doctor's office, a clinic, a physician's practice, et cetera, et cetera. Any given one standalone hospital could have potentially 12 to 18 different locations that receive items. Okay?
Right.
Every location that receives an affected item will get then mailed an alert, because that's the way the manufacturer will tell the FDA, this is how I'm making sure people understand there's a recall affecting this product.
And is that out of an abundance of caution? They just want to spray it so nobody can say they didn't see it? Or what's the thought process behind that? Do you know?
I don't think it's an abundance of caution. I think that's kind of how they filed their communication plan with the FDA to say, here's how we plan to alert people that are affected. Now, the reason for this is it's almost impossible for the suppliers to maintain proper contact information at every health system because of the different situations. So if you really think about it, I don't know you guys, but I have a terrible time maintaining my address book, my Rolodex. Right? Old geezers like myself call it a Rolodex. My kids don't know what a Rolodex is, but the fact of the matter is that information gets outdated very quickly, incredibly quickly. People move, they change jobs, they retire, etc. So suppliers can't keep up with any of that. If you try to understand just how big this is for any particular large device manufacturer, some of these folks might have 200,000 ship-to locations or more, right? So keeping the proper contact information for all these places is it's an impossibility, right? Now, 15 years ago or so, a different set of folks came out into the industry saying, we're going to try to help with some of this by creating these aggregated feeds of electronic alerts and try to give you information about everything that's going on in the recall world. So that gets us to today's point and to the answer to Hayes' question, which was, how many recall alerts does a hospital get? I can give you some true stats. Some of the folks that work with us, standalone pediatric hospitals, for example, might get 3,400 alerts in a year, but only about 200 of them actually apply to them, right? That's part of the inefficiency of today's industry process is in that abundance of caution or in that trying to make sure I don't miss a recall, the pendulum swung so far to the other way that now people are looking at recalls every day that don't matter, that don't affect them at all, right?
And do they know that when they get it? How much time and energy do they put into determining whether or not it's applicable? I mean, you think about the number of products that are in the hospital, that can't be something they're oh yeah, we don't have that. It's got to take time.
It takes time, and in fact, it's not an accurate, perfectly fail-safe process. So what they do is they look at their PO history, right? They look at their purchase history, trying to determine, did I even buy this item? The problem with that is, as you know, half of the recalls that take place in this country are batch or lot specific, and your PO history doesn't quite reflect that. So that means you're still going to be looking at a lot of recalls, even if you buy the model, while you might not be affected, right? But that is a lot of reporting and a lot of looking at your history and then trying to figure out where those items went, et cetera. Kind of crazy.
I was just going to say, is there one particular person in a hospital typically who's literally charged with that job? And if you get 3,400 a year and only 200 are real, there's got to be a point where they overlook some, right?
So, yeah, what you're talking about is alert fatigue, which is very real, right? And it's a fear of many VPs of supply chain and risk managers, actually, right? It's at what point does the human brain go, what are the chances, right? The last 300 I looked at don't affect us, so I'm just going to skip 2, or I'm not going to look as hard, or whatever the case may be.
Yeah, my day's going to hell, and it's not the only thing that I do, right?
It's kind of it's human, right? But
yeah,
to answer the question is, I think it depends on the health system and their organizational structure. So, for example, in a standalone hospital, and as you know, half of the hospitals in the U.S. are standalone hospitals, it might be one single person that's tasked with kind of coordinating recalls, right? In health systems that are broader, you got multi-state, multi-hospital health systems. They might have a hybrid model where they have a corporate person dealing with recalls at the corporate level, but then they have individual coordinators at each hospital. So you have the complexity starts getting tricky when it comes to who's done what, and am I sure everybody's done what they needed to do or not, right? That's a very tricky process.
How do they even manage the action planning around that then? Because, again, another manual process, I'm sure.
Yep. So the answer is in different ways and as best they can, right? But in some cases, they use workflow tools just to try to manage, assigning tasks to different people in the organization. What happens, though, is that those processes today, those workflow tools, et cetera, are missing one big important point in this whole kind of problem that we're trying to solve, right? That we're seeing in the industry, which is the hospital still needs to reply back to the supplier on that paper alert, right? Because that's how the supplier will report to the FDA saying, we've accomplished our mission of alerting people. That's the key point that nobody's actually addressed in 40 years. It's still paper.
So what does the supplier do about that? Are they just like hounding, or do they have to kind of say like the average response rate's 10%, and so it was 10% last year and now it's 11%, and so look at us, we just improved by 10%.
Yeah, unfortunately, it's not as easy as that, and this is where I feel a lot of pain for the suppliers, right? So they send let's say they send a wave of, we call them waves. Let's say they send the first wave of FedExes to 60,000 locations that need to be alerted. Then they wait a month or two to get responses back. Now, think about how crazy that is, right? If it's an important recall that could affect patient safety, you're still waiting. You're literally waiting. And you don't know if those hospitals have acted or not until you get a response back. Now, let's say that you get back 10, 15% responses. What's the next step? It's another wave. It's another wave to all the locations that haven't
You double
responded.
down on the communication and add more alerts to an already inefficient alert process.
Yeah. So what ends up happening is, in a really serious recall, we've heard of 6 and 7 waves of FedExes being sent. Now, when you really think about the length of a process of that magnitude, right? This is why you end up seeing recalls that last more than a year and a half, in some cases 2 years. What's crazy about that is sometimes there's a hospital out there that has not received the alert. The alert gets received at the receiving dock or goes to a doctor's office, but it doesn't actually make it to the coordinator, and that hospital is not aware of the recall necessarily. Now, and this is why that fear of, I'm going to miss out on a recall, so let me just get every piece of information, right? Every recall alert out there. That's also not good, right? None of those situations are actually good. But more importantly, and here's the craziest part. So I'm betting, Justin, that folks listening in will not even, at first, I'll do a double take on this, but you would think that if the supplier is spending what they're spending and FedExing overnight alerts, that hospitals would get it the next day, right? And this would be quick. First of all, it's millions of dollars in expense. But more importantly, the average in the country it takes for the recall coordinator at a hospital to get that FedEx, 16 plus days. Right?
That's
16 plus days. Isn't it? But
That's
get
not
this.
a pandemic stat. That's just a regular old stat.
That was pre-pandemic. That was pre-pandemic. After pandemic, we've added another 4 days because we've heard most providers are working still from home and they get their mail. The recall coordinators are picking up the mail once a week.
Yeah.
Right? So crazy.
That's insane. So is there a way to quantify how much one recall for one product costs one supplier? Is there a way to put a number to that?
We've done some calculations and estimations, and in fact, we've had some good discussions with different suppliers. So I can tell you that it varies a lot, right? So a small batch or lot recall will obviously have a much smaller, right? But you could look at very big ones. So highly distributed items, things like sutures or things like that, things that basically every hospital ends up having, or gowns, or anything that might be recall, any kind of supply really. In some cases, could be several $1 million. So when you think about a FedEx at anywhere from, depending on what they negotiate, anything from $15 to $20 per envelope, and you're sending on the first batch 130,000 FedExes, right? And then you do waves 2, 3, and 4, you start tallying it up, and it's a lot of money. But more importantly, it's months, right? And those are months where you could be affecting patients. A nurse or a doctor never want to harm a patient by using something unknowingly that they shouldn't be using. Right. That's
an incredible expense and just so inefficient. So my next question might be about, let's say it's an implantable. Let's say it's something that's inside the patient already. And then we find out there's an issue because obviously, the tracking and reporting there, how good is it? And do you normally find the patient that you need to find?
Well, that's actually, I do think that we have a better handle as a country on that today. Although if you recall, a while back, for example, France had a perfect scenario with this, or a perfect example of this, I should say, not a scenario, which was breast implants. They had a recall, a company had defective breast implants. There were thousands of women affected, and nobody knew who they were. There was no traceability around this, right? So they had to basically call every woman that had breast implants done so that they could take a look and figure out who had what. It was a nightmare, right? I think in our case, what ends up happening is in the U.S. today, and I would say pretty much in the developed world today, in a case like that, it'll be the surgeon determining what makes sense. In other words, not every implant that's recalled requires an explant.
Of course.
Right?
Yeah.
The example I always say is, listen, a hip implant on a 94-year-old patient that might develop metal shavings after 10 years, the surgeon will likely say it's probably more risky for this patient to come back to the OR than to just let him be, right? Totally different if the guy's a 24-year-old rugby player. So those are determinations that the surgeons and the physicians make. But I still think that today we have a good grip, at least on the supplier being able to tell who received the affected product. What we don't have is a good fast communication process between suppliers and providers, right? Paper in a day where you and I could buy a home. We can literally close on a home, get a mortgage, and refinance our car all in the same week without ever seeing anybody, without leaving our living room, right? We're still dealing with paper. And if you're wondering just how big this is, we've calculated that there's about 500,000 trees being chopped up every year to FedEx recalls all over the country.
Wow.
Right? Which is crazy.
Absolutely it is.
So this is just creating a complete disconnect between the suppliers, who also don't want to do the patient harm, and the providers who, as you already said, don't want to do the patient any harm. So I'm assuming that the frontline folks don't always know what's going on. And as part of that communication, does it create conflicts within the healthcare, either on the provider side solely or between providers and suppliers, where they're like, how come you didn't tell us? And they're like, we have told you. We just killed 500,000 trees telling you.
Yeah. It's fascinating. So at first I couldn't understand when I started digging into this problem, and I tried understanding, okay, how come this hasn't been solved in decades, right? Like, I understand not solving it maybe 30 years ago. The internet was probably just a nascent thing, if at all. And we all were kind of using these old 42K modems, and the world was different. But the fact of the matter is today there's a big disconnect, I think, between what providers understand are challenges for suppliers and vice versa, right? When it comes to a recall alert. So the providers already know, the hospitals already know, they don't want to get paper all over the place. By the way, this creates also additional challenges for providers, right? For example, somebody at a department, say at surgery, the head of surgery gets a recall alert directly delivered to him, and he's asking supply chain or sourcing, what are we doing about this recall? Well, if that paper hasn't reached sourcing at the same time or earlier, there's a disconnect and a breach of trust, right? At some point, the physician's saying, the guys that are in charge of supplies here don't know about this recall. How can that be happening? It's not their fault, obviously, but that's the system we have in place in the industry today, right? At the same time, there's a big kind of separation at a supplier between the post-market and quality folks that are the guys making decisions around recalls and the sales organization in that supplier, right? Rightly so. You want to have those folks separate. You don't want to have a conflict of interest. But what that causes then is some sort of disconnect between the hospitals that are dealing with the sales organization at the supplier and the folks at the post-market that are dealing with recalls and alerts, right? That makes it very tricky to solve unless you put everybody together at the table.
It's hard enough getting sales and operations to work together in a single organization and to really just, be humming along. It's another thing to have that silo then break out in this process where literally the healthcare organization, the sales reps and the people, that they're dealing with in supply chain are one thing, but then the ops and the providers are another thing. So you're actually staying siloed, almost like two different train tracks in and out of the hospital between supplier and provider. So one piece of communication may be going on one track and another piece of communication may be going on the other track. Eventually it hits somebody and they may not even feel like they're getting the same messaging. Am I right about that?
Yeah, I think what happens is one of the biggest challenges we have in the industry today is that the format and the nomenclature being used by suppliers to communicate recalls is not standard, right? So what ends up happening is, if a nurse receives 3 different recall paper alerts and they all have different formats and they're using different nomenclature to describe a recall, you're now leaving it up to that person to interpret. Not something a provider organization wants to do. They want to have a standardized approach that says, as an organization, this is what we're doing for this particular recall, right? So that's one of the issues. I think the other issue is the fact that because of the kind of data that each side of this industry looks at, there is a disconnect, right? Suppliers are looking at ship-to locations to determine who's affected. Providers don't think in terms of locations that way. They're thinking more about operations, departments, and how do I stop this item from being used on a patient, right? So providers are very frustrated sometimes when they go, I don't understand. I replied to this letter and they keep sending me alerts for the same recall. What they're not understanding is, yeah, you replied to one. Unfortunately, the supplier is sending 14 of them to your organization and is hoping you're going to respond to all of them, which obviously won't happen, right? So that's another kind of breakdown, I think, that, if you really think about it, the source process that we have, the single process that we have and the method that the industry uses is causing very different undesirable side effects for each side of the industry. But they're all caused by the same source, right? It's the process in use, nothing else.
So, all right, you've obviously been working on solving this challenge or you wouldn't know this much about it. But in your opinion, and maybe we're going super far into the future and maybe not, but what do you think the industry needs to solve this problem?
So that's a great question, Justin. I think the key is there's probably 2 components to it, right? One is, and I think we're there from, like, when I look at providers today, I do think that there's a widely understood agreement amongst the healthcare provider organizations that there's a challenge with the recall process today. Every hospital you talk to will tell you recalls are not fun, they're a challenge, And if you were to say, rate your process today from 1 to 10, they would say, do I rate it from what we can do, what I think we can do today, or do I rate it from 1 to 10, 10 being a perfect scenario where there's no failure in the process, right? Because they already know that is not today something that they have easily achievable. I think the key is, so banding of those providers and kind of locking arms and saying, we need to change this for the industry is one. How do you enable that then? Is basically direct communication between suppliers and providers through a hub, right? At the end of the day, electronic communication doesn't imply that everybody emails somebody, right? What you need is a record of truth. You need an audit trail that allows for kind of quote unquote certification of, we alerted these folks acknowledged and acted on the recall, and we have this kind of back on our corner again, right? That's what puts an end to the problem, all of the problems, really, all of the challenges we've been talking to. Not to mention, it shortens the time frame. I guess today, when you think about it, the biggest problem, or one of the biggest challenges, is if you are, as a supplier, going to spend 1.5 years working on a recall. And by the way, some of these large suppliers may have 40 recalls a year, right? They have a lot of products, right? That's a lot of potentially exposed patients, that needs to be sped up significantly.
And, it's interesting too, because I've seen a lot of articles recently and a study that came out in early May of this year as well, where they're calling it a SANSdemic, where there's just going to be less people for the amount of jobs that are out there. And so this kind of waste, for us to be able to sustain operations, it's got to go. So you really outlined the opportunity. Some of the statistics that you shared today were really strong and actually quite overwhelming. I just don't even know how this is not sustainable. We may have been getting away with it, but it's not sustainable with the amount of new products and technology and advancement that are coming out, knowing that there's going to be less people to manage the process going into the future. We're going to be looking to technology to making this sustainable. So I just have to thank you so much for coming on the show today and sharing your knowledge. You're very obviously unique individual. I enjoyed this one quite a bit.
Absolutely. I enjoyed it too.
Thank you so much for having me.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you both, Justin and Hayes. It's been great being here. Yes, I am passionate. I do believe a lot of times, I think that there are industry-wide problems that actually can be solved quite elegantly without over-engineering things, right? A lot of times it's more about a simple solution that's effective rather than coming up with very complex solutions to problems.
I couldn't agree more with that. If you want people to use it, you can't overcomplicate it at trying to address every single nuance that one customer or another may have. You need to have global application. So that was Guillermo Ramos, Chief Executive Officer at Notisphere, talking about product recalls today, Hayes. And honestly, I knew the process wasn't streamlined. And I knew that there was some responsibility on both sides of the table, but I don't think I was ever aware. I never had to manage this in any role that I've ever had. And I don't think I realized just how inefficient it is. And also, just with the technology boom in the last 20 years, you would think that there would be a lot more technology out there removing the steps in between, for the communication back and forth. And he really outlined, a gap in data, a gap in awareness, and a gap in communication that I think anybody who's listening to this, if they've had to touch recalls and management of recalls on any level, even if they just had to oversee the management of it, this interview is going to resonate with them. It's a clear need in the industry.
Oh, absolutely. Particularly when the specs say you can send it via telegraph. That's how old this thing is. And and obviously the technology that they provide and that's in the market, it's a huge win for where we are, but it is a massive problem. It's a multi-million-dollar problem. So he did a great job kind of giving us the background and the details about it.
Yeah. All right. Well, great job, Guillermo. Thanks for sharing your insights today. That's going to do it for this week's show. As a reminder, you can help support Power Supply by subscribing on Apple, Amazon, or Google Podcasts, as well as Stitcher, iHeartRadio, Spotify, or your favorite podcast application. We'd certainly appreciate a rating and review because your feedback is important to the show. And on behalf of Hayes, Gary, and myself, thank you for listening to this week's episode of Power Supply.